Okay, everyone. Now we're going to be talking about different kinds of research methods that scientists who study group dynamics can use. So we're going to be talking about case studies, experiments, and correlational studies, which are the common types of methods used uh, by the scientists. So start with case studies. With a case study, you wanted to take, one specific group or set of groups and really do an in-depth analysis of that group. You might do some interviews with the group members, do some observation of the group behavior, of the group in action. So a case study is like an in-depth examination of a single group. An example shown here is Irving Janis's research on the concept of groupthink, which is a characteristic of groups that become so cohesive and like insulated from everything else, they overestimate their own importance, and these various aspects of the group that lead to a desire to form consensus, a desire for everybody to agree, as opposed to the desire to make a really good decision. So oftentimes people will make poor decisions as a result of groupthink, because maybe people are afraid to speak their mind and everybody just wants to agree and be nice to each other. The classic example of real life groupthink came about with the Bay of Pigs invasion. That Kennedy administration, the Kennedy group that was discussing this, they thought it was a really good idea for Cuban anti-Castro people to start a rebellion to try to overthrow Cuba, but they were heavily overmatched, and the Bay of Pigs invasion was an absolute fiasco. And when you look back on it, you can see that it was a really, really stupid decision. So Janis argued that it was groupthink that led to this kind of poor decision making by people who were pretty smart but still made a dumb decision. But we'll talk more about groupthink as we get to the chapter on decision making. So here are some other examples of case studies that were discussed in the book. With the case study of the guy who joined up with the gang and kind of observed their behavior and interviewed them. That's an example of a case study, as well as these others here. Another example of a research method using group dynamics are experiments. Now, experiments are a little bit less common because it's often difficult to set up a circumstance where you are setting up an experiment. So you could do it. You're setting up groups in a laboratory. It can be done, but maybe kind of an artificial circumstance. But what the example talked about in the textbook, classic study where they set up groups of kids working on a project, and they had three different kinds of leadership. They had in one case they had a leader, an adult leader who was like directive and basically telling everybody what to do, kind of the authoritarian type leader, dictator. The other case was another case was democratic, where the group members kind of made their decisions about what to do, and the leader gave guidance to them and helping them making their decisions, but it was basically decisions by the group. They voted on what they wanted to do and so on. Finally, the laissez-faire group, basically the leader just sat back and let the group do whatever with no leadership whatsoever. And again, they compared the performance and the various aspects of the performance of the three groups. But, the kids were randomly assigned to either be in the directive leadership or the democratic leadership and so on. And that means essentially randomly assigning to groups is an important aspect setting up an experiment. You want basically the groups to be equal before you, more or less before you begin. You want to be able to assume that any differences are due to the independent variable. Now, in the case I talked about with Lewin, the independent variable was the type of leadership, and that was decided by the experimenter. The experimenter manipulates the independent variable. The experimenter manipulates who goes into the group that gets the directive leadership, who goes and gets into the group with the democratic leadership, and so on. And it was done basically randomly assigned to who goes to what group. The dependent variables in this case had to do with performance, how well they did. I think there was some talk about one of the things they said is maybe how much time they spent on the project, maybe versus wasting time. But there are various dependent variables, and the idea being that there are going to be differences between those groups based on the type of leadership that was the independent variable. And this was done in a laboratory environment. Other variables were controlled as much as possible, so the groups took place in the same setting. The project was the same. Everything was the same except for the type of leadership, and that's an indication of control of what are called extraneous variables, those other variables that could get in the way. What if one group was done in a light room and one group you worked in a dark room? You're not testing lightness or darkness, but that could be a variable that could get in the way of the findings you're looking for. The advantage of an experiment is that you can make a causal inference. You can essentially assume that any differences between the groups here are due to the effect of the independent variable, due to the effect of, in Lewin's study, the case of which type of leadership they were put under. Finally, another kind of research method are commonly used in group dynamics research is correlational research, correlational studies. And this is basically looking at the relationship between two variables. You can look at mathematically using a correlation coefficient, which essentially looks at the linear relationship between two variables, where you could take scores on variable 1, scores on variable 2, and put it essentially on a chart where you can more or less predict scores on one variable by scores on the other. So, for example, you're looking at a correlation between the number of hours you study and the score you get on your exam. So if I ask every one of you before your first exam, how many hours did you study? And maybe one person says, I studied 10 hours. Another person says, I studied 8 hours. Another person says, I studied 12 hours. Another person said, I studied 2 hours, right? And then I find out what you got, what your scores were on those exams. So each person would have a score on the exam and a score on the number of hours studied. And I would probably predict that the students who study more hours get higher grades. Is it going to be true for everybody? No. And can we assume that studying more hours is the direct cause of doing better? I would say it's a factor, but if you're just looking at correlation, you can't make the assumption that one causes the other. You'd have to turn it into an experiment in order to be able to make that conclusion. So an example of correlational studies in the area of group dynamics, discussed in the textbook, is Newcomb's study on the students who go to Bennington College in Vermont. Kind of a liberal attitude is prevalent at that college, and most of the students there do not come from liberal environments. But as they spend more time there, as they associate with more people there, these variables related to they're more liberal. They become more. Their attitude becomes more liberal, and you can measure at different times. Freshman year versus sophomore versus junior versus senior. There's a relationship between how long they've been there and their political attitudes, their liberal attitudes. So that's an example of research That's correlational because you can't necessarily say what causes what. You can't really control what is going on the campus there. But you can take a look at these variables and the relationship between each other, and you can see the link there. And this is a very useful thing to do. So, to sum up, here are some of the major differences between them. Case studies, we're talking typically about groups that may be unusual, may be special in some way, so you want to do an in-depth analysis of that one group, not your everyday ordinary groups. Unfortunately, the responses you're going to get are very subjective, as well as your interpretation of the responses might be subjective. So forget about determining cause and effect with a case study. But you can definitely use this to stimulate theory. You could use it to perhaps you set yourself up perhaps for maybe doing future research, either correlational or experimental research, to answer some questions that you can start with the case study. Experiments, a problem with experiments are they are done in a laboratory. The groups are not real groups. They're artificially created. But nevertheless, with a properly done experiment, you can be able to conclude cause and effect. If you've controlled all your variables, the potential external variables, you have randomly assigned to conditions, if you are making a clear, direct measurement of your independent variable, manipulation of your independent variable, then you might any findings you could say are due to your manipulation. But again, correlational studies, you're not dealing with cause and effect. But nevertheless, you're getting a lot of information. You can find a lot of information by looking at how variables are related to each other. It allows you to make predictions. For example, your ACT score is probably going to be correlated with your freshman GPA at college. The idea being that the higher your grade on your score on your ACT, the higher your GPA by the end of your freshman year. Is it going to be true for everybody? No. And can you assume cause and effect? Does doing a good job on your ACT cause you to do well in college? Of course not. But it allows you to make predictions. It allows you to see this connection there. So correlational research is very useful.